Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Scrapping for Less. Today I'm going to be using the Newton Loves Coffee stamp set by Newton's Nook. And I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is cut down to 4¼ by 5½. And I'm going to start by stamping my images and kind of masking them as I go along. This ended up not being all that necessary, but depending on how you create your background, you may want to mask them just in case. I'm going to be creating like a table or a countertop that these little cats are sitting on. So I'm stamping the first one as if he's sitting directly on it, and that one that's kind of peeking over the side of the counter obviously will be the back part of my table or counter. And then I'm just going to be stamping one of the mugs to make that look like it's sitting on the countertop as well. Now, the one little cat that's kind of peeking over does have a line on either side. So I'm going to take my T-square ruler and a Copic Safe pen to continue that line all the way across. And this will be the edge of my table or counter, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to continue that line, make it as straight as possible. Now, in order to create my countertop or table here, I wanted to make this a tile, like a regular ceramic tile. So I'm going to start off with my horizontal lines here, and I'm not measuring, but I want my lines to be closer together the further back they are. Perspective wise, if you're looking at something the way we're looking at this little scene here, the lines would appear to be closer together the further back we get. So like I said, I'm freehanding this. I'm not, making sure that my measurements are correct. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. Now for my vertical lines, I'm going to find the center first, and I'm going to create that perfectly straight. And then as we go off to the sides, it's going to be more angled. So the tiles in the back are going to appear as if they are smaller and closer together, and the ones up front will be larger. Even though that's not the way it actually is, that will be the way it appears. So I'm going to do this on both sides. And like I said, I'm freehanding this. I'm not making sure each line is, perfectly angled with the other side of the card. I'm just kind of going along with it. Once everything is colored, you won't necessarily know or notice if these aren't perfect. So once my little counter there was mapped out, we're going to go ahead and create our wall. And I wanted to make this really bright as far as my coffee mugs and the wall behind my little cats here. So I'm masking off the bottom with a piece of Post-it note tape, and I'm going to be using a few different colors of Distress Oxides. I'm using Spun Sugar, Picked Raspberry, and Worn Lipstick. And I'm starting off with my lightest color here just to kind of get a base on my cardstock itself. The darkest area is going to be towards the bottom behind my little cats, and then it's going to kind of fade off to lighter on the top. Now I'll kind of go back and forth here with all three of the colors. And once I got back to the spun sugar to put on the top of my card panel, it really wasn't blending with the other two colors at all. I think there was just too much of a difference. The worn lipstick and is pretty dark, is pretty bright. And it just was, the spun sugar was just a little bit too light to blend that out. So I did kind of go back and forth, and I ended up going back to my my worn lipstick without re-inking my ink blending tool. When I wasn't getting the blend I was looking for, and I did go over this several times, I just couldn't get it. So without re-inking my blending tool, I went in with the tool that I used for the worn lipstick and kind of used that to blend out. Now, some of my masks were coming up a little bit, so I went in the direction that they were peeling off. So in this case, I went up. So I started off at the bottom of where I'm doing my ink blending and kind of worked my way up towards the top to make sure that my masks didn't peel off anymore. And then it still had a little bit of a gradient. I wasn't necessarily getting the look I was going for, but it is what it is. So I did let this dry for a few minutes before I peeled off my masks because the Distress Oxides do take some time to dry. You want to be sure that you don't peel your paper or the top portion of your paper off when you're removing your masks. We'll go ahead and move on to the Copic coloring, and I'm going to do my little countertop or tabletop first. So I want these to be kind of gray or white tiles. So I'm going to add some shading to the bottom left of each of these little tiles. So I'm going to go in right with my darkest color, which is the C5, and you'll see that I'm starting my shading almost to the top on the left-hand side and then kind of making an L shape with my shading. And this took a little bit of time, so I'm not going to show you all of this. I'm just going to kind of show you the color combinations and how I did my shading. But I did these to each one of the tiles, not at this point, not paying attention to where my little objects would be casting shadows as far as the coffee cups and things like that. Next, I'll move on to the C3, and I'm pretty much just blending the C5 out, but leaving some room on the top right corner of each of my tiles. So I'm just using the tip of my marker, flicking that color out a little bit, and just making sure that these blend. And usually the cool grays do blend pretty easy, so you don't have a problem going in with your darkest color first. Once my C3 was down, I'll move on to my C1, and I'm not going to color each and every one of these tiles individually. I went over the entire area with the C1. Some of the little individual areas that may not have blended perfectly, I went back over that area, but for the most part, I just covered it up. And I'm using the side of my nib here because I'm covering up a large area. You don't necessarily have to use the tip. Next, I'll go in with the C7. I'm going to create a shadow underneath each of these objects. My little cat there holding the coffee cup and his tail, the individual coffee cups, and the little cat's paw there. Blend that out with the C5, and I'm concentrating directly under the objects and then off to the left a little bit, and then blending that out even further with the C3. And this will just create little shadows so that they're not just floating there. So for the coloring itself, we'll start off with this first cat, and I wanted to make him like an orange cat, kind of like Newton, except I just didn't give him his little stripes. But I don't have a ton of markers that would necessarily match this. So I'm only using a 3-color blend on this particular cat. I typically stick to a 4-color blend, especially for a larger object like this. But I did just do 3 here. I started off just by mapping out my darkest areas, which will be the shadows that his little paws create on his face off to the left-hand side, and where the coffee cup is kind of hanging over him as well. I accidentally covered or colored some of the coffee cup itself, not realizing that that's not part of the cat. So I just went in with my colorless blender to take that out. Next, I went on to my YR27 and pretty much just went over those areas that we had mapped out where the darkest areas will be. And then I'll go on to the YR24 and blending those areas out a little bit further. For my shadows, I typically stick to just a straight line, basically outlining where those shadows would be. And for larger areas like his face, where there's not necessarily a shadow, but we would have some contrast due to having a light source, I'm using some flicking motions. I also created a little bit of shading on his little paws where his little claws or toes would be, I guess. Finally, I went back in with that Y23 and filled in the rest of the area. Now, I did leave a larger highlight on this little guy than I normally do, just because I'm only using 3 colors. And like I said, I just didn't have the colors that would match Newton himself. If you haven't seen the real Newton, he does exist. Go follow Newton's Nook on Instagram, and they post lots of pictures of both of their cats, especially Newton, and they are adorable. So for this other little kitty here, I wanted to make him a darker gray, but I didn't want him to blend in with the countertop or the tabletop. So I'm going to switch over to the warm grays. And again, going right in with my darkest color because the grays blend so nicely. Just creating a shadow on the left side of him where that coffee cup would be casting a shadow, and above his little paw with the W7, blending that out with the W5, then the W3, and then finally the W1. Just keep in mind that when you go in with your lightest color, you will probably start moving around your darkest color. So if you overblend, you're going to lose those shadows and it will kind of become like muddy looking. Not really muddy looking, but kind of splotchy. I guess that's a better word, if that's even a word. And so you'll just want to make sure that you kind of go over those areas pretty quickly. Next, I took my R20 and just added a little bit of color to the inside of the little cat's ears and just gave them each a pink nose. And we'll move on to the coffee cups. Now, the coffee cups are round objects, so we'll want to make sure that we preserve a highlight in the center. So for this first one, I'm going to be using some RV markers, kind of matching the background or the wall behind these little cats. Starting off with my lightest color and just mapping out those darkest areas on either side of the coffee cup and on the bottom portion of the handle. Going in with the darkest color and just doing a few little flicks on either side of the coffee mug. To make something look shiny, you want to vary the lengths of your flicks, have some be a little bit longer than others. In this case, I knew I was going to be coloring that little paw print there, so I didn't necessarily worry about it. I'm not working with a ton of space here. Just as long as I preserve that highlight in the center, it will still appear to be a round object. So I went in with my two mid-tone colors and then finally the lightest color again. And I am going around the little paw print there because I'm going to be coloring that a different color. We're going to be doing a little bit of shading on that as well. I'm only using two colors here and I'm going to fill in the entire thing with my lightest color and then just add a little bit of shading again on either side. So the center portion would be the lightest. So I'm just adding a little bit of darkness to the, it's hard because it's different objects, but not all of them have a darker area depending on where they are in the mug, if that makes any sense to you guys. So for this next coffee mug, I'm going to be coloring this some purple colors. Again, starting off with the lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas on either side, going in with the darkest color, varying the lengths of my flicks. Now this coffee cup wouldn't necessarily be shiny, but I just kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what that would look like, being this is the largest mug or cup that we're working with. So I'm varying the length of my flicks, also making sure that I create a shadow above his little paw and his tail. And finally going in with that lightest color. For the sleeve, I'm going to switch over to some E30 markers, and this ended up blending in with the little cat a little bit too much. Even though I used some YR markers, they're kind of more of a brownish tone than they are orange or yellow. So I'm going to stamp an image directly on that once the coloring is done to kind of take away from the fact that this does blend in with the cat. For the lid of the cup, I wanted this to appear white, so I'm just going to go in with my C3 and add some shading on either side and kind of where the lines are within the image. Just use that as a guide as to where your shadow should be. I'll blend that out with my C1, but I am still leaving some white areas because I want this object to appear white. For this final coffee cup, I'm going to switch over to some BG markers. Again, going around those little polka dots because I wanted to color them a different color. So I'm doing my best to go around those, but concentrating my shading on either side with my darkest color, blending that out with my two mid-tones, and then finally the lightest color. Now, like I said, this is not a huge amount of space, so you don't necessarily need to use four colors here. I pretty much do that by habit. When you see me use only three or two, it's because either it's a really teeny tiny area or I just don't have the colors I'm looking for, so I'm kind of just working with what I got. For the little polka dots, I'm going to bring out those RV60 markers again and color them in with my lightest color first. And I'm using three colors here, and I'm only going to put my very darkest color on the two polka dots that are on the edges of the coffee cup because those would be the very darkest areas. And I'm just doing one little line. Then I'll go in with my mid-tone and extend those areas out, but also add some shading on the polka dots that are more in the center of the mug, and then finally going in with my lightest color and blending all of that out. For the coffee that is inside the mugs, I'm going to bring out some E50 markers, use my E55 as my highlight color, and just add a little bit of shading to either side of the coffee, I guess, with the E59, extend that out with the E57, and then finally going in back in with that E55 just for the center portion. Now I did take I think I took an R83 marker just to kind of fill in some of the areas that are a white around my little images where I didn't necessarily mask correctly. I don't even know if I showed you guys that on camera, but you can just take a Copic marker that closely matches your distress ink and you'll never know the difference. So I went ahead and stamped one of the hearts from the stamp set directly on that sleeve of that cup there, just to kind of differentiate that from the rest of the cat, I guess. So, this is where I take that marker just to fill in those areas. So I did show you guys. So I had a lot of empty space here. So I was going to trim down my panel, but then I ultimately decided to take a stitched rectangle die, and I believe this one's by MFT, but you can really use anything. But you do want to make sure that it's centered so those lines that you created for the tiles still make sense. So this way I have a nice border and I don't have as much blank space. Now the Post-it note tape that I used before running this through my Gemini took up some of that Distress Oxide ink, so I just took that ink blending tool, did not re-ink it, but kind of went over that area to blend it out, stamped my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and took a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to add some sparkle to just some of the things. I added some to the paw prints, the polka dots, and the little heart inside that little coffee cup sleeve there. Next, I took a top folding A2 size note card and I adhered my panel flat with my Tombow Mono multi glue. And that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day.